the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
On July 16th, 1945, humanity entered itself into the nuclear age.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
On July 20th, 1969, man would finally walk on the moon. Together, these technological innovations from space exploration and nuclear fission synthesized mankind's most destructive weapon, the intercontinental ballistic missile. A total of 3 nuclear weapons had been created by the end of World War II. Little Boy and Fat Man killed around 200,000 Japanese civilians, caused the unconditional surrender of Japan, and ended World War II. By 1983, the number of nuclear warheads that existed in the world increased to over 55,000. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is not one about a remarkable individual. Instead, Petrov's story is about the world he lived in and the powerful forces surrounding him. And Petrov's existence reduces down to resolving an entire generation's worth of mistakes. But how did he get there? The vast expanse of 5,000 miles between the United States and Russia was nothing compared to the ideological gap that separated the two. The Soviet Union's communist, authoritarian, and secular values were a direct challenge to the United States' capitalist, democratic, and evangelical values. This struggle for ideological dominance would shape global affairs for half a century following the end of World War II. During this period, the United States was so consumed with the fury of communism that they were willing to oppose it no matter the moral expense. Senator Joseph McCarthy's infamous Red Scare violated government-sanctioned civil liberties to interrogate those suspected of Russian espionage. The space race against the Soviet Union saw the United States pouring up to 4% of their federal budget into the NASA and Apollo programs, not out of scientific curiosity, but to beat Russia to the moon. Though the United States and the Soviet Union considered each other their greatest threats, they never declared war on each other. Had they done so, it would have likely resulted in world destruction. Over the next 2 decades, the US and the USSR continued to manufacture and accumulate nuclear weapons under brinkmanship. Because nuclear weapons were such potent tools of destruction, the only way to defend yourself against a nuclear attack was to have your own nuclear weapons. As time passed, the global nuclear stockpile expanded to such an extent that every significant population center in the US and the USSR was vulnerable to a nuclear strike. This led to an era called mutually assured destruction, where diplomacy was only possible at the brink of catastrophe. We got very close to that catastrophe with the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, which up to that point was the nearest our nation ever got to nuclear intervention. After nearly 2 weeks of tense negotiations, the two powers eventually came to terms. During this period, the possibility of nuclear annihilation wasn't just a far-fetched fantasy. It was a part of day-to-day life, so much so that American school children had to practice nuclear drills. After anticipating just how close they had come to total disaster, American and Soviet leaders opted to ease tensions for the next few years, entering a period of détente. Throughout détente, the US and USSR signed a series of international treaties, including a ban on above-ground nuclear testing and an agreement to limit the number of nuclear warheads. For the first time ever, the United States decreased its nuclear stockpile. But the ideological differences between the two nations were too great to ignore, and hostilities eventually resumed. The 1970s were a troublesome decade for the United States. With the failure of the Vietnam War, an economic recession, and the resignation of the president, patriotic fervor gave way to paranoia, and many presidents wanted change. Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States in 1980 in a landslide victory, and his aggressive stance against Russia seemed to be a welcome change from the previous administrations. Once again, relations with the so-called evil empire turned cold. By 1983, they had deteriorated to near Cuban Missile Crisis levels. In September of 1983, The USSR shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 passengers, including U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald. Soviet leaders were on edge, anticipating retaliation from the United States. At the slightest indication of a nuclear launch, the USSR were primed and ready to launch a counterattack.
Fellow Americans, I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean airline massacre, the attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane. This crime against humanity must never be forgotten, here or throughout the world.
September 26, 1983, slightly after the hours of midnight, in a military base near Moscow, a Soviet satellite warning system received a signal indicating the presence of one missile, followed by an additional 4 missiles, headed from the United States to the Soviet Union. Stan Petrov was faced with an unprecedented decision that would determine the fate of humanity. He correctly determined that the nuclear warning was a false alarm and no nukes were launched. Petrov reasoned that if the United States were to send a nuclear strike, that they'd send more than just 5 missiles. But, for a few fleeting moments, he and he alone controlled the destiny of 55,000 nuclear weapons, enough firepower to eradicate a majority of the world population in a matter of hours. Petrov's only say in the matter was whether or not to launch the weapons. He had no control over how or where they'd be used. If Petrov had reported the warning as an attack, it's unlikely anyone would have questioned it, especially given the heightened tensions of the time. You could argue that the president has the same amount of power, but the nuclear launch protocol is configured with a checks and balance system to prevent nuclear fallouts on a stir of the moment. However, the difference with Stan Petrov is that he was the protocol, and his judgment on whether or not to report the warning directly influenced if nuclear weapons were fired in retaliation that day. Consider the fundamental military training, where soldiers are programmed to obey authority without question and maintain loyalty to their country at any expense. Individuality is not emphasized in their training. Rather, they are taught to operate as a replaceable component of a bigger mechanism, and any deviation from their assigned role is usually not tolerated. If Petrov had solely followed his military training, he would have trusted the warning system and reported a nuclear strike. If the Soviet military protocol had operated as planned, life as we know it would have ended. The correct decision could only be made by Stan Petrov if he deliberately disobeyed the system. Now, imagine yourself, or the average person in this scenario. You're faced with a system that is informing you that your country and everyone you care about is being attacked by your fiercest geopolitical adversary, when tensions between you two are at an all-time high. You have no means to defend yourself against this attack, but you do have the power to bring justice to those responsible. There is no time to think it over. You must act now. How many of us would press the red button? How many of us would disregard our training and rely solely on our intuition that everything is really okay? One unsuspecting person had to make a solitary decision that symbolized the accumulation of millions of poor decisions made before him. Let us be grateful that, despite our sins, Stanislav Petrov chose wisely and spared us.